The gastrointestinal system mainly functions for motility, secretion, digestion, and absorption of nutrients. Motility refers to the movements that mix and circulate the GI contents and propel them along the length of the tract. GI contents are usually propelled in the ortograde or forward direction from the mouth toward the anus. As food enters the mouth, chewing or mastication mechanically chops food into smaller pieces so that it can be swallowed and propelled more easily. Food is also lubricated by mixing it with salivary mucus. If the food contains starch, salivary amylase that breaks down starch is added to the food during chewing. Swallowing is initiated voluntarily, but thereafter it is almost entirely under reflex control. This reflex allows food to be propelled from the mouth to the stomach. It also inhibits respiration to prevent the entrance of food into the trachea. Swallowing can be divided into three phases: the oral, pharyngeal, and the esophageal phase. The oral, or the voluntary phase, of swallowing is initiated when the tongue separates a bolus of food from the mass of food in the mouth. It then moves the bolus upwards and backwards into the mouth repeatedly before forcing the bolus into the pharynx, where it stimulates touch receptors that initiate the swallowing reflex. The next phase of swallowing is termed pharyngeal phase, which occurs in less than 1 second. The soft palate is pulled upward and the palatopharyngeal folds move inward toward one another to create a narrow passage, through which food moves into the pharynx and at the same time prevent reflux of food into the nasopharynx. Then the vocal cords are pulled together and the larynx is moved forward and upward against the epiglottis to prevent food from entering the trachea and reflexly inhibiting respiration. The upper esophageal sphincter, in turn, relaxes to receive the bolus. The constrictor muscles of the pharynx then contract to produce a peristaltic wave which strongly forces the bolus deeply into the pharynx towards the esophagus. The entry of bolus into the esophagus initiates a peristaltic wave along its length. This wave, called primary peristalsis, moves down the esophagus slowly up to 3 to 5 centimeters per second. Distension of the esophagus by the moving bolus initiates another wave called secondary peristalsis. Repetitive secondary peristalsis is required to clear the esophagus of the bolus. The swallow bolus also stimulates reflex relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter and the most proximal region of the stomach, propelling the bolus towards the stomach. This relaxation happens at the same time with each swallow to allow the stomach to accommodate large volumes with a minimal rise in intragastric pressure, a process called receptive relaxation. This is also accompanied by a release of gas, called belching. The proximal part of the stomach produces slow changes in tone compatible with its reservoir function, for mixing the contents with gastric juice, and for regulating gastric emptying. Low tone and consequently low intragastric pressure are associated with delayed, or slow gastric emptying, while increase in tone is required for gastric emptying to occur. The distal part of the stomach is important in the mixing of gastric contents and for propulsion into the duodenum. The thicker muscles of the antrum allow it to produce strong facet contractions. These contractions, initiated by the slow wave, begin in the mid-portion of the stomach and move toward the pylorus. The strength of this contraction varies during the postprandial period. In the gastric phase, the pylorus is usually closed and the central contractions serve to mix the gastric contents, reduce the size of solid particles, a process termed grinding, and empty the stomach contents into the duodenum. The entry of gastric contents into the duodenum happens at a highly regulated rate. This ensures that gastric contents are not emptied into the duodenum at a rate faster than the duodenum can neutralize gastric acid and process chyme. The gastroduodenal junction, on the other hand, prevents the regurgitation of duodenal contents back into the stomach. The emptying of gastric contents is regulated by neural and hormonal mechanisms. The duodenal and jejunal mucosa contain receptors that sense acidity, osmotic pressure, and products of fat and protein digestion, peptides and amino acids. Chyme that leaves the stomach is made even more hypertonic by the action of enzymes in the duodenum, slowing down gastric emptying. Chyme takes 2 to 4 hours to traverse the small intestine since it makes up about 3/4 of the length of the gastrointestinal tract. Digestion and absorption mostly occur in the duodenum and the jejunum. Movements of the small intestine mix chyme with digestive secretions, bring chyme in contact with the absorptive surface of the microvilli and propel chyme toward the colon. Submental contractions, which is the most common type of movement of the small intestine, mix and circulate its contents, but are not very propulsive. The slow rate of transport of intestinal contents allows adequate time for digestion and absorption. In contrast to segmentation, peristalsis is the progressive contraction of successive sections of the circular smooth muscle of the small intestine. These contractions move along the gastrointestinal tract in an orthograde direction but usually involve a short length of the intestine. The ileocecal sphincter separates the terminal end of the ileum from the cecum, which is the first part of the colon. Normally the sphincter is closed. However, short-range peristalsis in the terminal part of the ileum relaxes the sphincter and allows a small amount of chyme to squirt into the cecum. The colon absorbs majority of the 500 to 1500 milliliters of chyme which it receives from the ileum per day. The mixing resembles a kneading process as the chyme becomes semi-solid. In the proximal colon, antipropulsive contractions predominate which allows time for the absorption of salts and water. A wave of contraction called mass movement, which occurs in the colon 1 to 3 times daily, differs from a peristaltic wave because the contracted segments remain sustained for some time. Mass movements push the contents within a significant length of the colon in an orthograde direction. In the transverse and descending colon, haustral contractions mix and knead colonic contents to facilitate extraction of salts and water. Mass movements that occur in the colon sweep the colonic contents towards the anus. The rectum, which is usually empty, is more active in segmental contractions than the sigmoid colon. This is why the rectal contents tend to move in a retrograde direction into the sigmoid colon. The anal canal is tightly closed by the anal sphincters. Just before defecation, a mass movement in the sigmoid causes the rectum to fill. Filling of the rectum with feces initiates the defecation reflex. When circumstances are appropriate, an individual may voluntarily relax the external anal sphincter to allow defecation to proceed. Highly propulsive contractions of the descending and sigmoid colon are part of the defecation reflex. Defecation involves both reflex and voluntary actions.